So I thought I'd create a video on what it means, what the problems that can occur when you are testing internal, or when you're testing implementation details rather than behaviors. This was the big mistake I made when I was trying to learn test-driven development. And fantastic video by Ian Cooper that you can find on YouTube, titled "TDD, Where Did It All Go Wrong?" That was the light bulb moment for me in my understanding, and I created this. I'd created this repo to demonstrate something to someone else, and if it's useful to anyone, then yeah, hopefully this kind of might help. So what I've done, I've created a little kind of demo function, or a little demo application, if you like. It's only a tiny little thing, and I've actually done that. I actually created this using TDD, but that's kind of not the point. Although there is something I will kind of mention about that kind of later on. I've written a test which I then used to create an implementation. I deliberately over-engineered the implementation so that I could then go and write some bad tests, for what I think are bad tests for it, in order to illustrate, highlight the problems here. This is a trivial example, and it is exaggerated to kind of highlight the issues. But hopefully this is a fairly sort of straightforward test to follow. I've got this kind of concept of a cash till. So the idea, you go into a shop or something and they've got a cash till, you buy a number of things, each one costs a certain amount, and at the end it gives you a total. So here you've got this add up function which takes a list of values and it then produces a result which is a string that is the sum of those values prefixed with the currency. So in this case it's a pound sign. So with that test written, this is my implementation of it. Originally I'd got the prefixer and the adder basically in line, so it was all just kind of one function. But in order to highlight some of the issues that I've seen elsewhere, I've extracted the adder and prefixer details out to separate functions in order to highlight the kind of bad testing practices. So we can see adder just basically takes the array of numbers, it reduces it and produces a total amount. We've got prefixer takes a prefix and a string and just prepends the prefix to the string. So simple as that. But we can see those details, the adder and the prefixer, there's no mention of those within the test. But calling this function is necessarily testing the add up function from here, and it is testing the adder, and it is testing the prefixer. But they are just implementation details. They don't matter to this. The business requirement is that we've got a cash till that can add up a list of values and give us a result. That's the business requirement. The way I've seen this type of thing tested is, and this is, I have gone to town on making this as kind of as bad as it can be. I've stubbed the adder and I've stubbed the prefixer, and then so when I'm calling the cash till, I'm still getting a value. And obviously you'll notice the obvious kind of thing here, that I'm passing in 30 and 40, and I'm validating that it gives me back that result, which it can do because I'm stubbing these things and kind of returning, in this case, returning a kind of a static number from the adder mock, and then I'm verifying that the adder mock and the prefix mock get called, and I've then written tests for the adder function, and I've written tests for the prefixer. So everything in this thing, everything is covered, everything is tested, but there are three issues that I see here. One, the obvious one is we've had to write a lot more test code than we needed to. All the same things are being tested here. Well, all the same business needs are being tested here and across those three files and the kind of the load of code there. There are no other business requirements being tested. Secondly, if I came to this as a new developer and I want to understand what this application is supposed to do, if I have this function here, if I've got this test here, and that's the description of the system, that tells me what the system is supposed to do. If I come along and I've got these three tests here, then I'm now confused, because this seems to be sort of telling me that there are requirements that this adder thing needs to do this, that the prefixer needs to do this, that the cache till needs to exist and not only produce this value, but it also needs to use these, it should be using the adder and the prefixer. Now, it may be that there is some business requirement that says you must separate out the addition into a separate thing and a prefixer into a separate thing, and they must be used, in which case these are business requirements. But if the business requirement was just we want a cache till that adds things up and produces a value, then these other tests are just confusing my understanding of what the system is meant to do, what the requirements are of the system. They're irrelevant details. And the other problem is that if I want to modify the design of my code, so if I want to just to demonstrate the kind of this test working, if I just run that test, you'll see that that test run. If I run this one, we'll see it also passes. So the good test and the bad test both pass. But if I now change the design of the system, and I take my adder and I inline it to here, if I go and look at my good tests and I run that, my test still passes. If I go to the bad test and run it, my test now fails, and it fails because the adder mock is not being called. So the business requirements are still being met, so the test should pass. And yet, because I've changed, one implementation detail, my tests are now, the bad tests are failing. So I think that really is kind of, if you go through and set the tests up in such a rigid way, you won't notice it when you first build the system, or first build a system. You won't notice the problem. But if you come along and want to change design details of the system, you will find that you've been boxed in. Because if you have a new developer come along and they think, oh, I'll just inline this, and then the tests start failing, it's one thing to change implementation details where you think, okay, well, there are tests. It's all right, I've got test coverage. I can make changes to the design details. If the tests still pass, then we're all good. But if the tests start failing, then you should be able to assume that if the tests fail, you have broken the system. You shouldn't have to rewrite the tests because you've changed implementation details in the system. That's a dangerous place, because now you're having to, you've now lost the protection of the test, which is that the test will tell you when things fail. Well, now the tests aren't telling you when things are failing. They're telling you that the tests need to change along with the design details of the system, and that's not what we want from unit tests. So hopefully that articulates kind of like the problem that we need to try and avoid with that testing of implementation details. I'm going to add on another thing now to illustrate that this isn't an entirely kind of black and white scenario. And the example I'm going to use for this is the addition of calculating tax. So I've updated the spec for, let's just see if that one works now, hopefully it will do. yeah, I've updated the spec for my till, and I've now said that I want it to calculate tax on top of the amount. So we'll assume that these are net amounts, and I wanted to calculate a gross amount. And I could just have the cash till as part of its add up function add the tax on there. But I think specifically for this, I think that the calculation of tax is an interesting enough detail and a specific enough detail that I think that should be a concern that is kept separate from what the cash till is doing. There are rules around tax calculations that I think should be able to be tested in isolation and not through the interface of the cash till. And likewise, I might want a subject matter expert. I might want to work with the subject matter expert on the tax calculation part, in which case I want to be able to work with them on the specific details of that tax calculation, not have to do it through the cash till kind of like process. So what I've done here is said that I've got a calculator that in this case is calculating, it's adding 10% tax on. And what I've done is I'm calling the add up function, and the name of the function now is possibly not appropriate for exactly kind of what it's doing here, but hopefully it still illustrates the point that you call it basically kind of twice. First time you call it, it will configure the function where you give it a currency and you give it a tax calculator. And the tax calculator takes the number, returns the number, and then finally you call it with the amounts you want to add up, and it's then going to return you a value. If we look at then how that impacts on the implementation details of cash till, we can see what I've done is I've defined a type for my tax calculator, which, as I said, takes a number, returns the number, and I've now updated my function so that we've got this kind of configuration step that takes the currency symbol and the tax calculator. It uses the symbol with the prefixer, and it wraps the adder with the tax calculation. That is something. So that's an example of where I think it is appropriate to have something that is kind of separate. And then for that, I've then just done a sort of basic kind of a UK tax test there, which is checking that we're adding 20% VAT. And I've then got a UK tax implementation here that, again, just takes an amount and multiplies it by 1.2. So I could use that UK tax calculator with the cash till and a pound symbol, or I could implement a euro tax calculator, that kind of thing. So that's an example where I think it is appropriate to create effectively a boundary between the feature, which in this case is the cash till, and a specific other thing where it's interesting enough to be reasoned about on its own. I don't think things like, say in this case, the adder and the prefix, they're trivial things. If they were going to be used, something, and just to be clear, something that is trivial today, you think there's no point testing that separately, it might be that at some point in the future that is a useful thing to extract out to a separate module, and that needs tests of its own. But in this case, if it's still doing something trivial here, this is still the business need. This is what needs to be tested. Yeah, so that's my view on good and bad tests and how to avoid testing implementation details.